The road stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the black void of night. I'd been driving for hours, the hum of my truck's engine the only company on this lonely stretch of highway. My eyes were heavy, and the coffee in my thermos had long gone cold, but I was determined to push through. The promise of a warm bed at the next truck stop was enough to keep me going. It was around midnight when I saw him, a figure on the side of the road, arm outstretched, thumb pointed skyward. Hitchhikers were a rare sight on this highway, especially at this hour. My first instinct was to keep driving, but something about the way he stood there, so still and calm, made me tap the brakes. Maybe it was the way the wind seemed to swirl around him, or the faint, almost imperceptible smile on his face. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. He approached the truck with a casual gait, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. As he came into the dim light of my headlights, I saw that he was older than I expected, mid-40s maybe. His hair was dark and slicked back, his face gaunt but not unfriendly. He climbed into the passenger seat without a word, just a nod of thanks, and settled in as if he'd done this 1,000 times before. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my unease was growing. "Same way as you," he replied, his voice smooth and low, almost melodic. "Just keep driving." The miles rolled by in silence, the only sound the rhythmic thrum of the tires on the pavement. My unease grew with each passing minute. The hitchhiker sat beside me, staring straight ahead, his face obscured in the shadows of the cab. He hadn't said a word since climbing in, and I didn't feel inclined to break the silence. I glanced at him from the corner of my eye, trying to get a better look without being obvious. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the way his clothes seemed slightly out of place, like they belonged to a different era. Or maybe it was the way the temperature in the cab seemed to drop a few degrees since he'd gotten in. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the growing tension in my chest. It was probably just my imagination, the late hour playing tricks on me. But then I noticed something strange. No matter how much I drove, the scenery outside the truck didn't seem to change. The same trees, the same stretch of road, the same mile markers. It was as if we were trapped in some endless loop, driving through the same patch of highway over and over again. I glanced at the hitchhiker again, and this time I noticed his smile. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, curving the corners of his lips ever so slightly. A shiver ran down my spine, and I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "You should stop," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "It's not safe to keep going." His words hung in the air, thick and heavy. My heart raced as I fought to keep my composure. Something about his tone, calm yet insistent, sent a jolt of fear through me. I had the overwhelming urge to slam on the brakes, throw him out of the truck, and speed away as fast as I could. But I didn't. Instead, I forced myself to respond, my voice strained. "What do you mean it's not safe?" He turned to face me, his eyes glinting in the dim light. There was something unnervingly familiar about his gaze, as if he'd been watching me for a long time, longer than the few minutes he'd been in my truck. "You've been driving for a long time, Jack," he said, his voice taking on an almost sympathetic tone. "Too long, maybe. Don't you think it's time to rest?" A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. How did he know my name? I hadn't told him, and there was no way he could have seen it anywhere in the truck. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, but nothing added up. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. He chuckled, a low, chilling sound that seemed to vibrate through the cab. "I'm just a traveler, like you. But unlike you, I've already reached my destination." A sudden, overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white. I couldn't keep driving. I had to get away from this man, this thing that was sitting beside me. Without thinking, I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt in the middle of the deserted highway. The hitchhiker remained unfazed, still smiling that eerie, knowing smile. I turned to confront him, but the words caught in my throat. The passenger seat was empty. Panic surged through me as I stared at the empty seat. I could still feel the cold, lingering presence of the hitchhiker, as if he were somehow still there, watching me, mocking me. My breathing grew ragged, and I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of fear swirling inside me. I needed to get out of there. Fast. But when I reached for the gear shift, something stopped me. My hand froze as if an invisible force was holding it in place. I looked around, my eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing. Just the dark, empty road stretching out in both directions. Then the radio crackled to life. A burst of static filled the cab, followed by a low, distorted voice. "You can't escape," it whispered, each word dripping with malice. "You're mine now, Jack." My blood ran cold. The voice sounded like the Hitchhikers, but twisted, warped into something inhuman. I fumbled for the radio, desperate to shut it off, but the dial wouldn't budge. The voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. "You've been driving for too long," it hissed. "It's time to rest, Jack. Time to join me." The lights on the dashboard flickered, and the temperature in the cab plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I felt a crushing weight on my chest, as if the very air around me was thickening, suffocating me. Desperation clawed at me. I needed to get out, to run, but my body refused to move. The weight on my chest grew heavier, pressing down until I could barely breathe. The voice on the radio laughed, a cold, cruel sound that echoed in my skull. "There's no escape, Jack," it taunted. "You're already dead." A primal scream tore from my throat, fueled by sheer terror and the instinct to survive. In a sudden burst of adrenaline, I wrenched the door open and threw myself out of the truck. I hit the ground hard, the impact jarring, but I scrambled to my feet and ran, the gravel crunching under my boots as I sprinted away from the truck, away from that nightmare. The night was eerily silent as I ran, the cold air biting at my skin. My heart pounded in my chest and my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The highway stretched on endlessly, but I kept running, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever horror had taken over my truck. After what felt like hours, I finally collapsed by the side of the road, gasping for breath. My body trembled with exhaustion and fear, but at least I was alive. I glanced back, expecting to see the truck looming behind me, but it was gone. The road was empty, the only evidence of my ordeal the deep tire marks where the truck had skidded to a stop. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my mind reeling, trying to process what had happened. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I didn't know what that hitchhiker was or how he'd done what he did, but I knew one thing for certain: I would never pick up another hitchhiker again. When I finally found the strength to stand, the first light of dawn was breaking on the horizon. I started walking, my legs heavy, my mind numb. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to keep moving, keep walking until I reached somewhere safe, somewhere far away from that cursed stretch of highway. As I trudged down the road, the memory of the hitchhiker's smile lingered in my mind, a haunting reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything. But I was alive. And as long as I kept moving, I would stay that way. I had escaped, for now. The party had ended hours ago, and the rural roads were empty as I drove home in the pitch-black darkness. My headlights sliced through the fog, revealing only more winding asphalt and the occasional lonely tree. The night felt heavier than usual, the air thick with an unease I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the fog, or maybe it was the after effects of the few drinks I'd had, but something about this night, wrong. I was about 10 miles from home when I saw him, a man standing by the roadside, his thumb sticking out in the classic hitchhiker's pose. He was dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. Normally, I wouldn't have stopped. Who picks up hitchhikers in the middle of nowhere at this hour? But something compelled me to pull over. Maybe it was the way he stood there, so still, so expectant. Maybe it was the way his head slowly turned to face me, as if he'd known I was coming all along. As he approached, I could see his face more clearly, a gaunt, hollow-cheeked man in his late 30s, with piercing eyes that seemed to see right through me. He opened the passenger door without hesitation and slid into the seat, shutting the door with a soft click. "Thanks for stopping." he said, his voice low and smooth, but carrying an unsettling edge. Not many people would. No problem, I replied, forcing a smile. Where are you headed? Just keep driving, he said, his tone final, leaving no room for further questions. I didn't argue. I put the car in gear and started down the road again, but the unease in my gut only grew stronger. The man's presence filled the small space, pressing in on me, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the feeling of being watched. The silence between us was suffocating, broken only by the occasional hum of the tires on the asphalt and the low rumble of the engine. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind kept drifting back to the man sitting next to me. There was something off about him, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stole a glance at him, trying to be subtle. His face was turned towards me, his eyes hidden under the shadow of his hood, but I could feel his gaze, cold and intense. I wanted to say something, to break the tension, but my throat felt tight, the words trapped in my chest. The road ahead seemed endless, the fog thickening, wrapping the world in a dense, impenetrable blanket. I could barely see a few feet in front of the car, and every twist and turn felt like a step deeper into some dark, unknowable place. The man hadn't given me any directions, and I had no idea where I was heading. I felt like I was driving into the void. "Do you believe in fate?" he asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The question caught me off guard. I guess. Why? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Some people say everything happens for a reason," he said slowly, almost as if he was speaking to himself. "But I think some things just happen. No reason, no purpose." His words sent a chill down my spine. There was something unsettling about the way he said it, like he was trying to convey some terrible truth. My heart pounded in my chest, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He finally turned to look at me, his eyes catching the dim light from the dashboard. They were dark, hollow, like endless pits that seemed to suck the light right out of the air. "You'll see," he said softly. "Soon enough." The fog outside grew thicker with every mile, as if the night itself was closing in on us. I could barely see the road now, and my anxiety skyrocketed with every passing second. The man's cryptic words echoed in my mind, each repetition stoking the flames of fear that were quickly consuming me. I wanted to stop, to demand he get out of my car, but something held me back. A deep primal instinct telling me that whatever he was, I didn't want to anger him. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, though it was hard to focus on anything but the oppressive darkness outside. It was almost 3 a.m., the hour when the world feels most unreal, most vulnerable to the strange and the terrifying. "Are we close?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. He didn't answer, but instead pointed out the windshield. "There," he said simply. I followed his finger and saw it. An old, decrepit gas station on the side of the road, its flickering neon sign barely visible through the fog. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years, the windows boarded up, the pumps rusted and covered in grime. My stomach turned at the sight of it. "Pull in," he instructed. Every instinct screamed at me to keep driving, but my hands moved on their own, guiding the car off the road and into the station's cracked, crumbling lot. The car rolled to a stop, the engine idling softly in the suffocating quiet. "Why are we here?" I asked, my voice shaking now. He turned to face me fully, his dark eyes boring into mine. "This is where it ends," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Where it always ends." Panic gripped me. I reached for the door handle, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the car had locked me in, trapping me with this man, this thing that I was beginning to realize was not entirely human. "I'm not getting out," I said, trying to sound firm but failing miserably. He smiled, a slow, cruel curl of his lips. "You don't have to," he whispered. As soon as the words left his lips, the car's engine sputtered and died, plunging us into a silence so thick it was almost suffocating. The fog pressed against the windows, swirling like ghostly fingers trying to reach inside. I pounded on the door handle, desperate to escape, but it was no use. The car was dead, and I was trapped inside with him. Please, I begged, my voice cracking under the weight of my fear. Just let me go. I don't want any trouble. The man's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too many. It's not about what you want, he said, his voice low and sinister. It's about what's already been decided. The air in the car grew thick, almost tangible, and I felt a pressure building in my chest, as if something heavy was sitting on me. My vision blurred, and I could barely make out the man's face, but I could still see those eyes. Those dark, empty eyes that seemed to pull me in, drowning me in their abyss. Do you know what it feels like to die? He asked, his tone conversational, almost friendly. To feel everything you are, everything you've ever been, slip away into nothing? I couldn't breathe. My lungs burned, my heart pounded in my ears, and my mind raced with terror. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, strangled by the overwhelming fear that consumed me. You're almost there, he said softly, leaning in closer, his breath cold against my skin. Just let go. It'll be easier that way. My vision darkened at the edges, the world closing in around me. The last thing I saw before everything went black was his smile, wide and monstrous, as if he was savoring every moment of my terror. I jolted awake, gasping for breath, my body drenched in cold sweat. For a moment I was disoriented, my mind struggling to catch up with reality. I was still in my car, still parked at the gas station, but the man, he was gone. The passenger seat was empty, as if he had never been there. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the keys, which were still in the ignition. With a shaking breath, I turned them, and to my immense relief, the engine roared to life. The fog had cleared, and the first light of dawn was beginning to break on the horizon, casting the gas station in a pale, ghostly light. I didn't waste a second. I slammed the car into gear and tore out of the lot, the tires screeching as I sped down the road. My heart was still racing, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. I didn't understand what had happened, and I didn't want to. All I knew was that I had to get as far away from that place as possible. The drive home was a blur, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, my eyes darting to the passenger seat every few seconds, half expecting to see him sitting there again. But the seat remained empty, and the road ahead was clear. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the sun was fully up, and the world seemed normal again, safe even. But I knew better. I knew that what had happened in the darkness, on that lonely stretch of road, was real. The memory of those eyes, that smile, would haunt me forever. I sat in the car for a long time, the engine idling softly, as I tried to calm the storm of emotions raging inside me. I was alive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than death. I reached for my phone, my hands still shaking, and dialed a number. I didn't know who I was calling. Maybe a friend, maybe someone who could understand. But the line just rang and rang, no one picking up on the other end. Finally, I hung up and stared out at the morning light. I was safe now, I told myself. But deep down, I knew the truth. I would never truly be safe again. It was just after midnight when my phone pinged with a new ride request. The streets had grown eerily quiet, the usual bustle of the city replaced by a stillness that felt unsettling. The request came from a part of town I typically avoided, a neighborhood where abandoned buildings and empty lots stood as silent witnesses to better days. It was the kind of place where shadows seemed to linger, where the wind carried whispers of things best left unheard. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the cancel button, but the promise of a decent tip and the lure of one last fare pushed me to accept. As I drove, the city seemed to fade away, replaced by a landscape that felt more like a ghost town than a living, breathing place. The streetlights were sparse, casting long, distorted shadows that flickered ominously in the darkness. The only sound was the hum of my engine and the occasional rustle of trash in the wind. I arrived at an old, dilapidated gas station, its pumps rusted, its windows boarded up, and its sign barely hanging on by a thread. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine, a sense of foreboding settling deep in my gut. The app confirmed my passenger was here, but there was no one in sight. Just as I considered leaving, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, thin man in a dark coat that billowed slightly in the breeze. His face was hidden in the shadow of his hood, but something about him felt wrong. He opened the passenger door and slid into the seat. The air inside the car dropped several degrees, a cold that felt unnatural, as if it were seeping from the man himself. The city's lights quickly faded in the rearview mirror as we ventured deeper into the night. The streets became narrower, the buildings more spaced out, until there was nothing but darkness on either side of the road. The man beside me offered no directions, no hints about our destination, just silence, thick and suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. The road stretched out ahead of us, a lonely strip of asphalt cutting through a sea of shadows. The trees on either side loomed like sentinels, their branches twisted and gnarled, forming an archway that seemed to pull us further into the unknown. My heart raced, each beat a drum of fear that echoed in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to drop this man off and flee back to the safety of the city. But my hands remained locked on the wheel, as if they had a mind of their own. I stole a glance at the man, hoping to see something that would break the tension, but his face remained hidden in the shadow of his hood, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "How much further?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the sound of the tires on the pavement. "Just a little longer," he murmured, his tone flat and emotionless. "We're almost there." "Almost where?" I pressed, my unease growing into a cold knot of fear. He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge the question. The air in the car felt thicker, colder, as if the temperature were dropping with each passing mile. The road beneath us changed from smooth asphalt to cracked and uneven pavement. The trees on either side growing denser, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The headlights barely cut through the darkness, the world beyond them swallowed by an inky blackness that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. As we drove deeper into the woods, the silence became unbearable, pressing in on me from all sides. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, a winding path through a forest that felt more like a labyrinth designed to trap us. My thoughts raced, each one more desperate than the last. I stole another glance at the man beside me, hoping for some sign of humanity, some reassurance that this nightmare would end. But the sight of him only deepened my terror. The hood of his coat had slipped back slightly, revealing a portion of his face. Pale, almost translucent skin stretched tightly over sharp, angular bones. His eyes, sunken deep into their sockets, glowed faintly with a sickly, unnatural light. It was a face devoid of life, devoid of anything resembling a soul. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized the truth. I wasn't driving a man, but something else. Something that had crawled out of the darkest corners of the night. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. He didn't answer immediately, and for a moment I feared he wouldn't speak at all. But then, after what felt like an eternity, he replied, his voice softer, almost distant. "To a place forgotten by time, a place where the lost find their rest." I didn't understand his words, but they resonated with a deep, primal fear. I wanted nothing more than to turn the car around, to flee back to the safety of the city, but I couldn't move. It was as if I were trapped in a waking nightmare, bound by unseen chains that held me fast to my course. The road suddenly opened into a clearing, and in the pale light of the moon, I saw what lay ahead, a crumbling, ancient house, its walls covered in ivy and moss, its windows dark and hollow. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the car. I found myself lying on the cold, damp ground, the night air thick with the scent of decay. My body felt weak, as if all the strength had been drained from me, leaving me hollow and powerless. I struggled to sit up, my limbs trembling with the effort. The clearing was still, the trees looming over me like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The man was nowhere to be seen, but I could feel his presence all around me, like a shadow that refused to leave. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, but the sight of the dilapidated house standing at the edge of the clearing sent a fresh wave of terror through me. Its windows were dark and empty, like eyes staring into the abyss. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting wood, a scent that clung to the back of my throat. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled beneath me, sending me crashing back to the ground. Panic surged through me as I realized how weak I had become, as if the man's touch had drained the very essence of life from my body. My heart pounded in my chest, and I fought to keep my breathing steady, to hold back the rising tide of terror that threatened to overwhelm me. But then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the dead leaves that littered the ground. I turned my head, fear gripping me as the man emerged from the shadows, his gaunt face twisted into a cruel smile. "Welcome," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You're just in time." Time had no meaning in the void that followed. I was trapped in darkness, my mind twisted and torn by the malevolent force that had claimed me. I was no longer Mark, the man who had driven through the city's streets just hours before. I was something else, something hollow, something broken. When I finally awoke, I was back in the clearing, the man standing over me, his cruel smile still in place. But something had changed. I could feel it deep within me, a cold, empty void where my soul had once been. I was no longer human. I was something else, something born of the shadows and the void. "Rise," he commanded, and I obeyed, my body moving on its own, no longer under my control. I stood before him, my mind numb, my thoughts no longer my own. The darkness inside me pulsed with a life of its own, a malevolent force that had taken root in my very being. The man stepped back, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "You are ready," he said. "It is time for you to take your place among us." I followed him without question, my mind a blank slate, my body moving with an unnatural grace. We walked through the woods, the trees parting before us as if bowing to their master. The world around me was different now, darker, colder, and filled with the whispers of the shadows that had claimed me. We reached the edge of the forest, where my car still sat, its engine idling softly in the night. The man gestured for me to get in, and I obeyed, sliding into the driver's seat without hesitation. My journey had only just begun.